All right, we're going to go ahead and get started with today's webinar. This webinar is a public comment webinar on the Reserve's revised approach to permanence. This webinar will be recorded and posted on our website. So just getting right into it. In terms of housekeeping, everybody is in a listen-only mode. We will be taking any questions during the webinar. Please go ahead and put those into the chat, and we will address those later during the presentation. And as I just mentioned, we are recording this webinar. Just a really brief note on who the Reserve is. We are an independent crediting program, and we serve in both the voluntary and compliance markets. And to date, we've issued approximately 250 million credits, and we do have protocols, carbon credit methodologies across different sectors, as well as in various jurisdictions, including North America, Latin America, and the Caribbean, and in China. And we are rapidly expanding our protocols. And just to get into the agenda, and I guess I should also make introductions. Apologies for that. My name's Kristen Gorgonpour. I'm the Vice President of Technical at the Climate Action Reserve. And I'm joined by my colleagues, Robin Ricks, who is the president, Mackenzie Smith, who is Associate Director of Market Development for North America and Canada, as well as John Remicall, who is our Director of Protocol Development. So they'll be joining in this presentation. And the plan today, really, in terms of what the roadmap looks like for this webinar is, I'll give a brief introduction about, why we are revising our approach. I'll talk a little bit about the process that we went through to develop this revised approach. And then we'll get into all of the details and kind of provide the context of the approach. And then we'll have an opportunity for anyone to ask any clarifying questions, and then talk about next steps and how you can provide official public comment. Okay. So just getting into kind of, why are we, why did we put out this revised approach? So the Reserve has had a longstanding approach for permanence and longstanding mechanisms for implementing our policy. But given all of the evolving science, a lot of change in the market, we know that there are new tools to kind of implement and think about permanence and really enforce that. And so we felt like it was a good time to really rethink our policy and revisit it and think about, are there any changes that can be made to help, improve the program and encourage project development. So I think with this approach, what we're really trying to achieve here and with the design of this revised approach is really how can we strengthen integrity and also strengthen transparency with regards to permanence. And so we've developed this revised approach, and we think we've achieved that. And I do want to note in terms of the scope, this is really just for our voluntary protocols reporting under our program, so the Reserve protocols. So how did we kind of take on this work? So we did launch a work program back in September of 2025, this last fall, to really ask these questions of how should we be defining permanence? What is an appropriate length for a commitment period for projects to be reporting under the program? Who should hold responsibility for any reversals? And then we also decided to look at our buffer pool design and kind of assess that. Does that make sense? Is there any changes that we should be making? And as part of this work program, we also put together a stakeholder work group of diverse market experts to really like provide input into the things that we were kind of digging into and thinking about so that we could get feedback from a diverse perspectives to really inform this approach. And as part of that stakeholder engagement, we did hold 8 meetings with the work group from December through June of this year, and really appreciate all the time and effort that work group has and expertise that work group has provided. So in terms of just the revised approach, and we're going to get into all of the details of the approach and the different mechanisms, but really there's kind of these like 5 overarching components here. So we do have a standard commitment period of 40 years, and we'll talk about how that works and how that can be extended. We've really focused on ongoing responsibility of who should be, responsible for any reversals during the commitment period. And then another key aspect is really this like flexible mechanism or management tools for thinking about how to manage that liability, particularly during the commitment period. So what those buffer pool contributions may be, and also thinking about, is there ways to change that and kind of reduce those contributions with appropriate mechanisms. We also dug into what should post commitment period management look like for permanence, and thought about what are some options that we could implement. And then a big component is also just transparency. This is a key component of the reserves program overall. But we thought about how can we really convey this information about what is happening with projects that are managing permanence and impermanence risk, and how can we provide that information to the market so that they can make decisions about what's happening with these credits in our program. So just as a overarching kind of diagram to really kind of set the stage of before we get into the details of kind of what this approach looks like. And essentially what we have is this commitment period, or a defined commitment period with a standard timeline that's programmatic but may vary by protocol. And then thinking also about how we kind of extend that management of long-term carbon storage and giving folks options, or project developers options for managing that. And so that may be by extension of the commitment period or these other flexible management options that we are hoping to implement. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to my colleague, John Remical, to really get into the details of the revised approach.
Thanks, Kristen. Yeah, so just to start out, I'm going to talk about some of the key concepts that are kind of important to the revised approach that we're presenting today. First is just starting out with the concept or definition around permanence itself. Permanence is a fundamental characteristic of a credit related to the CO2 that's associated with a credit being stored out of the atmosphere long enough to support the mitigation claim being made through the use of the credit. Both durability and permanence are used in the market these days, and we've chosen to continue using permanence as we have in the past. In the end, though, any claims made using credits should be aligned with the length of time that carbon is being stored. And we believe that there's value to carbon dioxide being stored out of the atmosphere across different lengths of time. And to help us account for the length of storage and the risk of reversal to the stored carbon, we're using what we'll be referring to as the reabsorption curve for carbon dioxide. Kristen, if you can go to the next slide, please. So just to introduce you to the concept of the reabsorption curve for CO2, the idea is when carbon dioxide is emitted into the atmosphere, some of that emission begins to be reabsorbed out of the atmosphere by the biosphere. And although there's somewhat rapid reabsorption in the near term, the amount of reabsorption occurring over time slows, resulting in this long tail to the curve as it stretches out over time. As you'll see in the upcoming slides, this framework helps us to think about both the benefit of stored carbon and the risk of reversal as they relate to the passage of time after a credit is issued. So next we want to talk about the commitment period. As a basic definition, the commitment period is the total length of time that a project is committing to conducting monitoring, reporting, and verification, or MRV, of its credited carbon and to compensate for any reversals. Credits are only ever issued during a commitment period, and 40 years will be the standard length of a commitment period relative to the project's start date. However, shorter commitment periods may be allowed under some protocols. At the same time, every protocol will identify the minimum amount of time that a project must commit to monitoring and compensation for reversals. And the intent there is to make sure that additionality is maintained. Lastly, although projects will initially commit to a specified commitment period, again, typically 40 years, they'd also have the option to extend their commitment period up to 40 years at a time. Meaning, for example, if a project is 10 years into its commitment period, it could have its commitment period extended 40 years from then. So it would have an overall commitment of 50 years relative to the start date for the project. The important thing is projects can extend their commitment period at any point in time during their current commitment period, and they would not be making commitments to our program at any point in time for periods of time longer than 40 years into the future. Next slide, please. Okay, so now let's talk about how reversals are managed during the commitment period. Reversal is defined as the release of previously credited greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And we further make the distinction between avoidable reversals, which are caused by intentional acts or gross negligence, and unavoidable reversals, which are caused by things like natural disturbances such as wildfires. Under our revised permanence approach, when a reversal occurs, one credit will have to be used to compensate for each credit that is reversed. We did consider different approaches here, including recognizing the time value of the carbon that was stored prior to release, meaning we would have required somewhat less than one credit to be used to compensate for each credit reversed. We also considered requiring avoidable reversals to be compensated at a 1-to-1 ratio, while allowing unavoidable reversals to be compensated for based on the time value of the stored carbon at the time it was reversed. In the end, we elected to require all reversals to be compensated on a 1-to-1 ratio. All projects are also required to contribute to the reserves buffer pool, though contribution rates will be able to be reduced if mitigating actions are taken that address the risk of reversal, including via things like insurance. And lastly, once a project's commitment period ends, buffer pool credits associated with the project will be canceled. And just to note here, we did consider maintaining contributed credits in the buffer pool indefinitely once a project's commitment period ends, as well as returning buffer pool contributions to projects at the end of the commitment period. But we ultimately decided on canceling buffer pool contributions. Next slide, please. Okay, so coming back to the reabsorption curve, we can look at what a credit represents in terms of the relationship between emitted CO2, as represented again by the blue shaded area above the x-axis here, and the sequestered or stored carbon underlying the credit being used to counteract or mitigate that emission, is represented here by the green shaded box below the x-axis. As you can see here, the intent with our revised approach is for 100% of the credited carbon to be maintained throughout the entirety of the commitment period. And if any of that credited carbon is reversed during the commitment period, it'll be replaced, thereby keeping the green shaded area whole. Next slide, please. An important aspect of our revised approach is that we also wanted to provide projects with the option of addressing the risk of reversals to previously credited carbon stocks after a project's commitment period ends. We've initially identified three ways they could do this, though we will continue to explore other opportunities in the future as well. And just to note, these are all things that would have to be done sometime during or at the latest at the conclusion of a project's commitment period. So the first way they can address the risk of reversal after a project's commitment period is to undertake an action that mitigates the risk of reversal in the future, such as putting a conservation easement on the project area with provisions that limit the risk of certain causes of reversals. The second way is to transfer the liability of reversal monitoring and compensation to a third party that's eligible to manage that liability over the long term, which could be something like a permanence trust or other fund-based mechanism. And finally, the third option is to cancel credits that are considered to have a negligible risk of reversal in an amount in line with the reabsorption curve, which I'll discuss a little bit more on the next slide. Those types of credits are yet to be fully defined, though they might include credits from landfill projects that are abating methane or high durability removal projects like biochar. Next slide, please. So this slide is intended to just further illustrate that third option of canceling credits with negligible risk of reversal. The idea here is that at the end of the commitment period, some portion of the emitted CO2 that's being mitigated through the use of a credit will have been reabsorbed out of the atmosphere, but there will also be a substantial portion that is still in the atmosphere and will remain there for a long period of time, as shown in the tail of the curve going off to the right side of the screen. If a project doesn't want to commit to other ways of monitoring or mitigating for ongoing reversal risks, they can instead acquire and cancel an amount of credits with negligible reversal risk equivalent to the amount of mitigated CO2 estimated to be remaining in the atmosphere at the end of the commitment period based on the reabsorption curve. So in the case of a 40-year commitment period, approximately 50% of the emitted CO2 that was mitigated through the use of credits issued from the first year of the project will still be in the atmosphere. So an amount equal to 50% of the used credits could be canceled to address the CO2 remaining in the atmosphere, as represented by the hatched tail of the reabsorption curve here. By canceling those credits with negligible reversal risk, the risk of reversal associated with the originally issued credits is effectively extinguished during that period of time after the commitment period when there's otherwise no longer any mitigation or monitoring and compensation for reversals that'll be happening for those original credits. And with that, I'm going to pass things over to Mackenzie.
Great, thanks, John. One key component of our revised framework is transparency. It is our goal to disclose relevant information on the registry to ensure the market can clearly and easily assess how long carbon has been stored out of the atmosphere. For each credit, this would include commitment periods, start dates, and end dates, and therefore the length. How projects will monitor carbon stocks and compensate for losses in case of a reversal during the commitment period, and whether or not and how the project manages reversal risk after the commitment period. Next slide. The reserve recognizes the potential impacts of this revised approach on existing projects and has therefore provided these projects with options, which include either remaining under the existing approach through the end of their current commitment period or voluntarily transitioning to the revised approach. We'd like to note that we will be developing further guidance for existing projects on the details of these two different options. Next slide. And to provide you with a sense of timelines for implementation, we have summarized these current and next steps. Right now, as you know, we're in a public consultation period, which includes this public comment webinar, and are receiving written comments until next Monday, June 22nd. We will then incorporate these comments or changes as we see fit, and depending on the extent of the comments we receive, we will take it to our board as early as later this month in June. Once we've taken the approach to our board and received approval, we'll move forward into implementation, which includes both changes to our program and program manual and rules, as well as changes to the various protocols that may be impacted and their supporting documentation. Next slide. As mentioned, and to reiterate timelines and our current public comment period, we are receiving comments until next Monday, June 22nd. That would be end of day Pacific time, which will add a time. This is where you should direct all of your official comments and feedback. But if you do have any clarifying questions here today, we do have the remainder of the hour to receive your questions and provide what feedback and clarifications we can. I believe the chat function is open for you to send direct messages to the hosts and panelists, which includes ourselves. So you can please direct any uh, clarifying questions in the chat function. We will review these messages that are sent to us. I'll read them aloud and attribute names and organizations for context. As well, then we will respond to those comments directing first to Kristen and the rest of the team. So I see there's already one clarifying question in the chat that's been sent to us. We will leave that open and pause now for a minute, and then we will get started with responding to your clarifying questions. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Mackenzie and John. I know that was a lot of information, and we've already received one question in the chat with regards to the cancellation of credits. And this is from Elsie. I noted that you had made this comment when we were talking about the buffer pool, but we also talk about cancellation when we're dealing with impermanence risk. So I'll talk about both. So for the buffer pool, at the end of the commitment period, we'll go ahead and cancel out the credits, and that means they're not being used for any type of like climate mitigation or used as an offset. They're essentially just canceled out of the system. They will show on the registry as canceled. They're essentially just no longer a credit that can be used. And so that's what we'll do with the buffer pool at the end of the crediting period, or excuse me, the commitment period. And then for projects that want to kind of manage the long-term impermanence risk of their credits, they can also cancel the credits. So they would kind of give those to the reserve and we would cancel them out, and it would have the same status. Essentially, they're not being used to mitigate any emission. They're just canceled out of the registry. But I will say, like, all of this information is like public. Any credit we issue, we always monitor the status of that credit, and it will be publicly available of like what was canceled out. Any other clarifying questions? Hopefully everyone has access to the chat. I know sometimes that can be a challenge. We'll give it a minute. See. So one of the clarifying questions we received is the applicability of this like policy and if it would apply to all reserve protocols, including the Mexico Forest Protocol. And yes, it would. It applies to all of the reserves protocols that have where we issue credits that have reversal risk and need to be monitored. And as Mackenzie mentioned earlier, for our existing projects, they will have the option to kind of remain under our current approach, or they can choose to kind of move to this revised approach, and we'll be providing additional details in terms of what would be required to do that. So another question we received from Tom is that other registries are using the term durability um, um, to, and which may be more accurate for nature-based solutions where maybe those credits are inherently impermanent. Is there a reason that the reserve has used permanence instead of durability? Yeah, I think it's a great question and something that we talked a lot about during the work group. As you know, there's different initiatives happening in the market and really trying to define these terms. And part of the reason that we went with the term permanence is because this is a term that's kind of used by a lot of like the standard setting organizations in the market. And so to kind of really be clear that, these credits do have long-term storage and do meet certain criteria of these standard setting bodies. We've gone with the term permanence, but understand that it does kind of align with durability. And Robin, I think you want to make a comment about this as well.
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. Thank you very much, Tom. I just want to sort of just back up what Kristen said. Footnote 2 in the document sort of explains the choice. It was a conscious one. To be very upfront, durability, it's probably the better term. All carbon storage inherently probabilistic. It's accurate, allows for sort of that more of that spectrum than maybe the binary nature of what permanence might denote. But as Kristen and I just really want to sort of double down on this, that the reality is until such time as the sector moves comprehensively towards durability as opposed to permanence, the last thing we would want to do is to prematurely abandon the term permanence, because that could create some issues if there's like institutional lock-in or any sort of path to penance that's been created with that word. So Tom, you're not wrong to raise the question, and frankly, I think our organization's position is to agree with this shift, but we're not quite there yet.
Thanks, Robin. Okay. Another clarifying credit question, excuse me, that we got was in relation to the option of using credits with negligible reversal risk to kind of manage that ongoing and permanence risk. And that this is a mechanism of like horizontal stacking. And if the reserve is doing that, not supportive of this, and whether the reserve's trying to avoid this framing. I think from the reserve's perspective, in terms of like the mechanisms that we're providing, is really particularly after the end of the commitment period, we recognize that there's this ongoing and permanence risk, and we are trying to provide options for project developers or credit buyers to manage that risk depending on the types of claims that they're wishing to make about using those credits. And the intent is really to provide that flexibility. So I think where that makes sense for that project developer or for that credit buyer, we want to enable that. And it's really kind of providing those mechanisms for them to meet their needs of how they're wishing to meet their claims. And I don't know if others have thoughts on that. but we're really focused on addressing that impermanence risk and providing that transparency about kind of what happened after the commitment period there. There's no other questions, but I'll wait a minute because I know sometimes it takes a moment to add in a question. And maybe while folks are gathering their thoughts, I'll just jump to kind of the next slide here. In terms of next steps, Mackenzie detailed the kind of the process that we're kind of going through to finalize this process. But for receiving or for submitting comments, official comments, please submit them by Monday, the 22nd. And those comments can be set to policy at Climate Action Reserve. And we really do welcome your input. And then we will be kind of reviewing all of those comments and maybe taking those into account as we're working to finalize this policy. We will be posting this webinar publicly. So if you do have colleagues that were unable to attend, this will be available for them. Yeah, we welcome all of your comments to kind of help inform a robust and rigorous and transparent approach and policy. And just as a follow-up to my previous comments about like the horizontal stacking of credits, I mean, we don't view this as temporary credits. I think we recognize that this is kind of one mechanism of kind of thinking about guaranteeing long-term storage of credits and really documenting that and addressing that long-term permanence risk. But we don't view that as like a temporary solution. I think with the revised policy in general, as I mentioned earlier, like the heart of it is really like the transparency. So how long are projects reporting to the reserve? And then after that commitment period is over, what mechanisms do they have in place to manage that long-term storage and permanence risk? And we will be kind of disclosing what they're doing to achieve that. One of the questions that clarifying questions that we've received is, the change from the 100-year permanence and redefining kind of the standard commitment period. And I think with the 40 years, what we're thinking about is what is a practical time frame to really enforce ongoing monitoring, reporting, and verification. And our viewpoint, and based off of feedback that we've received, is that to really enforce that mechanism and think about what's practical, we really need to think about generational timelines, and people need to be able to make decisions on those generational timelines, which is about 40 years. But this doesn't mean that ongoing monitoring may stop at 40 years. Projects, as we've discussed, could extend that commitment period, and they're doing that in that generational timeline. And then they also have the option to really think about, well, I want to even extend that even further. What other practical mechanisms do we have in place to really extend that carbon storage and deliver that long-term climate benefit? Any other questions? Okay. Well, just to reiterate before we close out again, please submit your written comments to policy. If there is a question that you have to clarify anything with the policy that will help inform your public comments, please don't hesitate to reach out to that policy inbox. We will respond to any clarifying questions that you might have. But again, just to reiterate, really do value like stakeholder engagement, and it really helps us to develop a robust policy. Sorry, just there's one more question here, so just taking a look. Do we have time? So I think the question that we received is, how do we demonstrate that a 40-year commitment delivers climate integrity compared to the 100-year expectation? I think, again, one of the key things here is really like transparency and enforceability. And so I think as projects are continuing to report to the reserve on these timeframes, it's something that we feel very confident that is enforceable and that project developers can deliver, like they can do this ongoing MRV. But as I noted before, we understand that people may seek to have longer term carbon storage, and there's mechanisms to do that. Really, with this like standard commitment time period, we are really being realistic about what can someone make a decision about, but providing them with options for extending that time period. And as well as like we believe this gives confidence, right, that we can enforce these mechanisms over this time frame. But this does not prevent folks from project developers from extending that time frame and really thinking about what are the best options for them to kind of meet that long-term storage that they would like to achieve with their projects. So one of the questions is, how long will it take for project developers maybe to change their commitment periods, particularly if they're under our current approach, and thinking about implementing the revised approach. This is a great question. I think we want to implement our policies as quickly as possible. We've talked a little bit about the timeline, but where we can make changes quickly, we will implement those. So I can't give an exact timeline, but I think there's different mechanisms that we'll be able to implement relatively quickly, whether it's updates to our project implementation agreements, with regards to insurance. we know that there is a lot of advancement in the market, and it's something that we are looking at and are eager to implement as well. So this is something that I think, depending on the comments that we received during public comment, and the impacts to the revised policy, I think as we finalize the policy, this is something that we're really targeting for the next couple of quarters so that we can get all this great work implemented and really deliver that flexibility to project developers. So one of the questions is whether the reserve has assessed whether the revised permanence approach would strengthen alignment with ICVCM core carbon principles and future Article 6 expectations. So starting there, as a CCP approved program, we are always looking at, being in compliance and alignment with ICVCM's core carbon principles. And so currently, we believe this aligns with that. And that's something that we do think about as well. I think for Article 6 as well, this is something that we are actively looking at and considering because we do want to again, have credits that are issued under the reserves program applicable across the market. And so something that we do look at and believe we do align with that. We do understand that there is that the ICVCM is taking ongoing work with regards to permanence, and this is something that we'll be following closely and participating in as well to make sure that we're in alignment, and if we need to make any changes, we would adjust as necessary. And one of the other questions is, do we anticipate that this revised framework could become a model for other standards, their accrediting programs, or other mechanisms like Article 6.4? I think when we think about our policy, we really think about the broader market and how this fits in. And so, as I mentioned, we do think we're kind of aligned. We are aligned with market expectations. And I think for other programs, those are kind of their decisions with how they would like to kind of proceed with their approaches. But I would say, as I mentioned, we're really thinking about how does this work throughout the market. That's a good questions. Okay. Well, with that, I want to thank everyone for their time. We look forward to your feedback, and we hope you have a great rest of your day. Thanks so much.